Welcome to the New Books Network.
You are hearing Misa Azteca, the Aztec Mass, by composer Joseph Julian Gonzalez. Another musician who later became his wife, Monique Gonzalez, helped him expand the piece as they combined indigenous Mesoamerican elements with European ones to make a unique offering to the universal God, King of the universe. In their research and writing, the Gonzalezes studied an ancient song, the Cuicapeu Cayot, or Origin of Songs, an ancient Mexica narrative that foreshadows the 1531 apparition of Our Lady to a simple indigenous commoner, Cuautla Toatzin, who was later baptized Juan Diego, and whom we are about to celebrate between December 9th and 12th, the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Empress of the Americas, the Queen of Mexico. In their new book, Guadalupe and the Flower World Prophecy, a very readable and very impressive work of history and anthropology, the Gonzalezes argue that God had prepared the Mesoamerican people to receive Christianity, that this Nahua myth had been inserted into history to make Our Lady comprehensible to the Nahua people, leading to 10 million conversions, at a time when the Spanish conquistadors and encomenderos were making a mess of the New World with their slavery and their greed, polluting the evangelical work of the humble friars preaching the gospel. So let's talk it over as we approach the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe and enter the Advent season on Almost Good Catholics. So welcome both of you. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and especially to read this beautiful book.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Chris. Yes.
So do you have a joke to share?
Oh, yes. We even rehearsed it. Let's see if we could pull it off. What is Beethoven's favorite fruit?
Banana.
Banana.
You've heard that one before, yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, well, you are musicians. You wrote a very, very good history book. I wouldn't have known you were not historians just because of the excellent research, the authorities that you pull into it. So what is the story? How did you get into the story? What is the history?
Well, as you said, I'm a composer, and what composers do is oftentimes our minds wander, and that happened to me when I was driving from Los Angeles to the Central California Valley way back in the 1990s, early 1990s. I was driving along and suddenly I heard this piece of music in my head. It was a symphonic piece. I noticed it had the Kyrie eleison in it. So I thought, okay, this is something from the Roman Catholic Mass. But what was peculiar about it was that it had Aztec rhythms and percussion. And of course, when I heard that, I thought, well, this must be a Mexican composer. So I ran down a list of composers in my mind and different pieces that I thought I must have heard this somewhere before. But then suddenly it hit me that I was actually being inspired in the moment, that this piece was being composed as I was hearing it. And I thought, wow, this is really fantastic. So I got so excited. Of course, I started unconsciously pressing down on the accelerator of my car, and I think I hit 96 or something. I think well, of course, I know that because I got pulled over from the California Highway Patrol I was given a ticket. I had to go to driver's school, all that. And on the ticket, I think it did say I was going 96. But while the officer was writing up the ticket, I always keep music paper with me. So I started trying to write down what I was hearing. And that started off this, eventually turned into a 14-year odyssey into this. Well, to connect the dots, essentially, the main premise of this piece was to talk about the Spanish idea of the mass and the Aztec world. And that got me into this area called Aztec poetry, which I'm sure we're going to go into, but it carries on to when I met Monique in 2009. So go ahead and tell us what happened then.
So really briefly, when Joseph first found the Cantares Mexicanos and he read the first poem.
The Cantares Mexicanos is a collection of Aztec poetry.
So when he first read it, and the first song at the top, it sounded so much like the Guadalupe story that it threw him off, and he kind of lost his faith for a period of time. It took him a few years to come back, and then around 2008, he had a massive reconversion. I met him in the beginning of 2009, and when I met him, he hired me as his assistant. And one of the first things he had me doing was he'd recently gotten a request from Carnegie Hall to do his full piece Misa Azteca in its entirety. So what he wanted to do was to add a couple more movements to that, or pieces of songs or into that new piece. So he turned to me and said, well, if you can help me find some song poems to build new pieces upon, that'd be great. He hands me this book with all of these ancient song poems. I go to the first song, and what do I see? It's a song that sounds just like the Guadalupe story. So I was kind of shocked, and I pulled him into the office and said, can you tell me about this? Because it sounds so much like the Guadalupe story. What do you know? And he's like, well, it's not quite that simple, because if you go look on the translator's notes at the back of the book, I think you should read what he has to say. And what we discovered, or what I discovered for the first time, was that the translator was saying that this must be the basis for a future fabricated narrative of the Guadalupe story. And we were so completely thrown off by that. I thought, well, I don't know if I completely buy that, but maybe let's start looking into it. Let's start researching it. And between us, from that point, it became a 14-year odyssey, or what we call our wonderful obsession, so to speak, where we just figured out we have to get to the bottom of this, because we were just encountering so many issues with secular scholars constantly trying to tear down the Guadalupe story and the tilma and everything else, that we just had to figure out what it was all about. And so this began.
Yeah, well, that is providential. I think perhaps miraculous. It feels that way to me. That the idea that you heard the mass that you were to compose is literal inspiration, and it reminds me of the scene in the 1980s movie Amadeus, where Mozart's wife is showing his work to his rival Salieri, and he's like, "How can these be originals?" Mozart just hears music completed, and here you are, another mortal who is taking dictation from God. And composing this beautiful mass. I'll put a link to it in the notes below, because I was listening to it this weekend as I was reading your book, and and it's just it's lovely. I'm not a musician, but I can feel the classic Latin mass elements, and I can hear the Mesoamerican percussive elements, and I can hear the romantic trumpet, and there's all these different cool things that all work together, and the birds. So I hope we will talk a bit about that. So remind us of the Guadalupe story. Who is Juan Diego, whose original name was Cuauhtlatoatzin? I'm going to say it wrong, but he was a common man, a poor Mazahual Mexica Indian, minding his own business, and he had this remarkable story.
To kind of preface it really quickly is to talk a little bit about the background that was happening right before the series of 4 days of apparitions. Was, the Mexica Empire fell in 1521, and over the course of the next 10 years, there was an attempt to evangelize the natives and bring them over to Christianity, but they were running into a lot of walls with that because of just huge traditions of polygamy and idolatry and slavery, just a lot of practices that were antithetical to Christianity, as well as some of the other things that we're going to be bringing up in the course of our conversation. So by the time Juan Diego comes in, the Franciscans were about ready to pack it up and go home. In fact, Bishop Zumarraga actually wrote to the Emperor of Spain and said, we might as well pack up and go home because it isn't working. It isn't as many as conversions as we initially thought. And Juan Diego was one of the few who did convert. Contrary to a lot of popular belief, he actually was not Mexica. He was actually something called Texcocan, as well as his town was a part of another group. But what's interesting is that particular group, there were quite a number from the Texcocans that converted, and he was one among them. So one day on December 9th, at least in our calendar, December 9th, 1531, he was going to Mass. It was about a 14-mile walk. And as he's walking along, he passes a hill named Tepeyac. And as he gets to the foot of it, he finds himself swept into this paradisal realm. And it's just filled with color and lights, everything's sparkling. And he's just surrounded by music. And it has such an intense reaction to him. We find him exclaiming, and these are his first words, "Am I worthy of what I hear?" And this is an important line. We'll go into further details. Why is that important? But if you can keep that in mind, as I prepare to say the next line, the next thing he says is, could I be in the place my ancient ancestors spoke of, the flower paradise in the land of heaven? And the moment he says this line, it might seem like a throwaway line, but we've discovered it's actually not. It's an indicator of the entire story of Mesoamerica, but we don't know it initially. And the term that he uses in his native Nahuatl language is a term that will be used a lot in the book and even in our conversation. And the term is Inxoxitlalpan and Tonacatlalpan. That means basically the flower world paradise. And the flower world paradise is actually the name of a solar and floral indigenous belief system that millions shared over a huge geographical region, like lasting thousands of miles. So it actually goes all the way up in like Wyoming and Idaho, goes through the entire American Southwest, all of Mesoamerica, and to the top of South America. So there's a lot of people that had a belief in that. And the reason why we know that is because over the last 30 years, archaeologists, anthropologists, and linguists have discovered this flower world paradise, and it's indicated by archaeological ruins, as well as, pottery shards and murals, but also, and this is where our Misa Azteca comes in, is indigenous song poems that describe this place. And also where they're pondering, why is this place important? What is it teaching us? And I'll turn it over to Joseph to kind of talk more about that.
Well, basically what happens in the story, so he goes to this place called Tepeyac, he hears this beautiful music, and the Virgin Mary appears to him and she says very interesting things. The way she identifies herself as the mother of the god of far and near. In Nahuatl, the language that they were speaking to each other, it's Intloquenahuaque. That's an important point, and we'll bring that up later. But she requests that a temple be built on the top of that mountain. So what happens is that Juan Diego needs to convince the local bishop, Bishop Zumarraga, the one that we had just mentioned, the one who was so much in despair over the failure of the missionary efforts. So he travels over to the bishop to give the Blessed Virgin Mary's message. And the bishop, of course, doesn't believe him. And he is kind of set with a certain amount of trials. I mean, he's an indigenous elderly man who only speaks Nahuatl, doesn't even speak Spanish, and must convince the bishop. So eventually what ends up happening is that the bishop asks for a miracle. And that miracle gets back to, he relays it to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the Blessed Virgin Mary says, come back the next day. Well, what ends up happening is that Juan Diego's uncle, Bernardino, ends up getting sick. So this obstacle comes, another, a personal problem comes, and he ends up not meeting her on the west side of the mountain. He meets her on the east side of the mountain. This is a very important point that we go into in our book. And Guadalupe, the Blessed Virgin Mary as Guadalupe, points Juan Diego to the top of Tepeyac Hill, where he goes up and he finds the flowers, these miraculous flowers, beautiful flowers. He brings these flowers down in his tilma, or his cloak, an outer garment that he is wearing. He brings them as true as proof of this miracle happening. He shows them to the bishop. As he opens them up, the image of Guadalupe appears, and that's the famous image that is one of the most reproduced images in the world right now. And that's a basic outline of this story. But as we're saying, this story, which eventually led to millions of conversions, and of course we still have the physical tilma, this physical image today, is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to this story. Monique was alluding to it a little while ago, but that's a basic synopsis of the story.
Yeah, and I showed you at the beginning the poster here in my classroom, and I have it as a sticker on my car, and I see it at the basement of the church where my son's scout troop meets, and I see it, of course, inside the church, and I see it everywhere I go. It's significant that the Virgin Mary appears as an Indian woman. It's significant that she speaks to him in his native language. Like she doesn't look, she doesn't look like a Northern Italian Renaissance painting. She looks more familiar. So the God of near and far, and everything. And you write that the conversions catapulted or skyrocketed after this, right?
Yes,
Millions.
They say 9 to 10 millions were converted
in the following decade after her appearance. So that would be between 1531 and 1541.
Yeah, and so and it's very important. And I think we should add that the impediment that was happening earlier was the missionaries were getting into their own way. And even if the missionaries were good men, they were also working with these conquistadores and encomenderos who were not behaving in a Christian way, who are often exploiting the indigenous people for their labor and service and just trying to get rich and gather up gold. Well, that could ruin the gospel message right quick. And so here she comes in person, and in a way that is, more familiar and not foreign. You quote a lot from the Ricard book, The Spiritual Conquest of Mexico. Yeah, one of the things that I remember, I read it in graduate school, so over 10 years ago, but I just remember how at some point, I think is in 1555, but I could have this fact wrong, that they stopped accepting indigenous people to the priesthood, which just seems like a terrible move. If you're a universal church and you're trying to reach everybody, the very first ones, there's a lot of people who maybe have one indigenous parent, one Spanish parent, or maybe just become, very effective missionaries. But the empire got in its own way and was ruining things. And this beautiful intervention by Our Lady changed it. Okay, so that's the story. But then you discovered this in the Cantares Mexicanos. You found a similar story that was causing trouble for people who are critical, but and also at least initially for you as well. Yes. Yeah.
What Monique was alluding to is that when I saw this poem, when I started my research on Aztec poetry, I got my hands on this book, Cantares Mexicanos, by a gentleman named John Beerhorst, who's an anthropologist, and who actually was the first one to translate in any language these 90 song poems. And this is in 1985, so this is fairly
really
recent.
Yeah.
And so I read it back in the early 1990s, and of course I saw this first poem that shook my world because it was so similar to the Guadalupe story. And of course they were saying this is the source material for a fabricated Guadalupe narrative. So it's all a hoax. Of course, I'm Mexican American, as you stated, Guadalupe is everywhere. My grandma's name is Guadalupe. I even went to Our Lady of Guadalupe Elementary School. It caused a lot of problems and really hurt my faith because I thought to myself, this is it. This is the way the Spaniards did it. They copied things from the indigenous in order to dupe them. And it caused a lot of problems. And of course, Monique explained the way that it hit her back in 2009, several years later. But as we embarked on this 14-year odyssey, we were trying to be as open-minded as possible. We were saying, okay, we're willing to see to the point that Guadalupe is perhaps a hoax if that's where the research leads us to. And we were really trying to not be biased in it. We just wanted an explanation. We really were. And what we really found was that given everything that we saw, of course, we read several books that actually are critical of the whole Guadalupe event. But when you took into account this poem and other secular research areas in this one area called Flower World, which Monique alluded to a little bit, is that this could all be seen as evangelical preparation, that this can actually be interpreted as a way in which God prepared the indigenous. Because the explanations that secular scholars give, you could really poke a lot of holes in it really, really easily. And of course, we're getting into Guadalupe apologetics, but in which we vowed to stay away from in our book because it's just a whole other rabbit hole. But the thing is that there had to be another explanation. And of course, we as believers said, well, God does do supernatural things. He did lead the Hebrews on that side of the world through prophecy, through things that were implanted into their culture. You could look at that, which all led to the Messiah. And of course, this idea of preparatio evangelica, or evangelical preparation, is something that was accepted in early Christian doctrine. So it's a way in which missionaries went out and they were able to, so to speak, being able to use things within pagan cultures, concepts. St. Paul did that on Mars Hill, to be able to convert the people. But what's really unique about this story is that the missionaries were actually primarily against Guadalupe. And we can get into that a little bit. The story is a little bit unique because it seems as if God was speaking directly to the indigenous people in order to convert them with elements that were within the Guadalupe narrative. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. But I hope I answered your question.
You did indeed. And so I think that's very important. So, Bishop Sumaraga and the other missionaries who would not have been acquainted with this narrative, they wouldn't know what they were seeing, right? This would be a direct message in cultural terms, only understandable to the different Nahuatl people, the Mexica, or you said Texcocan. Where is he from?
Texcoco is part of the Triple
Texcoco,
Alliance at Texcoco.
Yeah, so from all around that giant lake, and the shared stuff, and you say all the way up north and all the way down south, elements that would not have been comprehensible to outsider Europeans arriving there.
Correct.
That's how they weren't that clever. They couldn't have planted that in anyway. And I think that happens all the time. I was talking to a anthropologist about ancient Near Eastern religions. Well, a lot of those elements in old Babylonian religions reappear in the Hebrew Bible, except for this time, God is not like an angry dragon devouring his children. God is a loving father who values every human life infinitely. So he takes existing symbols and he flips them into something way more joyful and redeeming and affirming, and something like truly is the good news. So would you tell us the original story about the flower world paradise and how it's a disappointment, and then how Our Lady flips it?
Okay, so the Cuicapecayal, or the origin of the songs, we'll keep it simple so people can remember it more easily. This origin of the songs is basically the story of a singer who's looking for precious, sweet, holy flowers. And he starts asking all of the environmental, like the birds and the butterflies around him, where can I find these flowers? And what's really interesting is that eventually one bird, a hummingbird, steps forward to lead him into this flower world paradise that's just swimming with sound and light, and everything's emanating light and music. And in this place, he supposedly finds these flowers and then gathers them in his tilma and carries it down because he wants to share them with his people. But part of the crux of the story is that he only seems to do that. He doesn't actually do that. And when he discovers that he didn't actually do that, you start seeing the song, it's a song poem, the narrative, turn into a lament where he's crying out and saying, why couldn't I get those flowers? But he also gives the answer in the same vein. He says, it's because I'm worthless, because I sin on earth. That's why I can't catch and possess those flowers and bring them back down. He says, but what's nice about it is that even in the course of that poem, he's also saying, he gives an out as to how someone can get the flowers. And he says, the way you can get an out and get the flowers is if the god of far and near and Tloke Nawake makes you worthy. And there's this constant emphasis on worthiness to be able to possess these glistening, iridescent, incredible smelling flowers. So the ancient song ends with him never able to achieve his quest. He kind of fails in that, which is, and so you feel the whole weight of that sadness in the ancient singer. And by virtue of the ancient singer, all of ancient Mesoamerican man is lamenting that they can't find the flowers.
Right. And what we learn when we get into the concept of flower world is that we see that kind of the hidden meaning underneath this story. Essentially, the flowers become a metaphor for truth, that the singer is actually looking for the truth of life and existence that could be found in these flowers. And just to give you a little bit of the take on flowers, is that the flowers, it's a relation of the flower as being a connection between heaven and earth through beauty, which now we're getting into the aspects of beauty, truth, and goodness, the transcendentals, that early Mesoamerican man actually had a concept of the transcendentals, and one can reach that heavenly place through beauty. And what is this heavenly place? Well, the heavenly place is the flower world paradise. Mm-hmm. The flowers come from this flower world paradise, and the singer is trying to call down inspiration from heaven. In fact, when we start talking about these flower song poems, flower and song and truth are used interchangeably, that we find in these poems where the singer is saying, I call down my flowers from heaven. I, the singer, sing the flowers. I'm searching for these flowers of truth. And of course, this is found in the flower world paradise. The same, using the exact same term in Xochitlalpan, Intonacatlalpan, the phrase to which Juan Diego refers at the beginning of the Nican Mopoa. So there's much more that we can go into, but you're talking about the way that it was impediment. Of course, it was an impediment for us because of the way the scholars frame it as being a hoax, okay? Of course, that's the way that it's basically seen in secular circles these days. But what we're trying to do, at least for the believers, is to be able to show that you can't really understand the Guadalupe encounter unless you understand, what do the flowers mean? What does the flower world paradise mean that Juan Diego refers to at the beginning? And once we start talking about flower world, we can go even more depth. And of course, when we start talking about Aztec flower song poems.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add that this reminds me of the expulsion of the Garden of Eden, and you guys talk about Paradise Lost, that phrase from Milton. But I cut you off, Monique. What were you going to say?
So the reason why this story is important is because a lot of our understanding of the tilma hinges on us believing the story first, because a lot of people may not be aware, but in the historical record, there isn't evidence of millions of people flocking to Tepeyac and singing the tilma. And so they had to have been converted by something a little bit different, only because the historical record doesn't support it. And a lot of secular scholars use that as ammunition as to why that might not have been true. So if we take that in consideration and start looking at the power of the story in and of itself, and how it mirrors, or not mirrors, but actually is a monomyth or a hero's journey, and take it in the context of that enables us to kind of understand how the indigenous might have absorbed it.
Right, exactly. What I would add to that is that we are in no way denigrating the importance of the role of the tilma.
It is miraculous.
It is miraculous. It's part of, but what we're basically saying is that it's part of a bigger story.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I think the reason why we have to bring up kind of these historical anomalies about it is because we kind of have to face it. We have to say there is an earlier poem that sounds like the Guadalupe story. There is not enough historical evidence to support that millions flocked to Tepeyac before they converted. We have to present an alternative reason why this happened, because Guadalupe is in the front line of this battle of ideas.
Yes.
And it is making a lot of, especially young college students who may take a Latin American survey course, where Guadalupe is taught as a myth, as a fabrication. We have to get into that fight on a scholarly level. And this book is really kind of the first salvo, or one of the first salvos in this direction.
Yeah, and it's really a question of perspectives. And if we start from a point of view where we believe that God created the whole everything from the beginning to the end, and for him it exists, as a unity, and for us it exists as, I only know what's happened so far. I can't tell you what'll happen in an hour, but God knows it already, and he's just telling this wonderful story that plays out in each of us, down to the fact that he knows if a hair on your head will turn black to white. He knows all of that, and so he has chosen to speak to us in such a way because for some reason God is love, and God is relationship, and what he desires is for us to have this adventure here in relationship, discovering what he has created, which you connect to the true myth. And you gave us the lovely example of the two old Oxford fellows, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and how Tolkien, the Catholic who took C.S. Lewis, the atheist, and converted him to Christianity. I think he later became an Anglican, but he told Lewis, hey, read this gospel as a myth. Read this gospel as a myth, because then you'll understand it, even though it's a true myth, even though there was a Pontius Pilate, there was a Jesus of Nazareth, and there was a Caesar Tiberius and all that. What is the true myth? How does that work?
Well, to understand the true myth, maybe it would help to do a quick breakdown of the hero's journey, or the monomyth.
Yes, sure. And that's Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, but mostly Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. What was kind of cool about it is that, we all kind of understand that myths kind of express sort of the deep human need to understand our meaning in the world. And what Joseph Campbell came along was that he realized that a lot of them have the same structure. And the basic structure is you have an ordinary person in an ordinary world who's pulled into an adventure or a quest of some type that he has to achieve in order to, I guess, to get to the next point. And along the course of that, he encounters lots of conflicts and obstacles that are trying to prevent him from achieving that quest. But in the process of that, he also gets help. He has mentors and friends that will help him to achieve it and get over all of those obstacles. And they invariably will always encounter some type of movement where they have to go through some type of internal death, or maybe they actually die in actuality and are resurrected. And after that, they then achieve their quest. And once that's done, they usually have some type of physical memento to show that they achieved their quest, that they then want to take back home to share with everyone that they love. And that's the basic story of the hero's journey. The way true myth kind of ties into that is when Tolkien and C.S. Lewis came along, and Tolkien was trying to convert, C.S. Lewis. They have a shared love of myth, shared love of story. And thankfully, Tolkien was able to kind of insert a little bit of a paradigm shift to Lewis, that maybe the reason for all of these myths, or these monomyths, was because it's preparatory for something else, or maybe somebody else. And into that gap, he was able to show that Christ could be the fulfillment of that hero's journey, that they all exist in order to explain who Jesus is and why he does what he does. So,
but the major difference here is that those are myth, those are stories. But what happened with Jesus is that he was truly a historical figure. He really did live on the earth. He really did die and was resurrected. So he conquered death. So therefore, he's stepping into the historical timeline as a true myth. And with that concept of the true myth, it lighted up the light bulb in C.S. Lewis's mind, where he was able to see all this backstory leading to one point, that all of mankind, universal history, if you want to look at it, was all pointing in one direction, and that was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who takes away the sins of the world and makes paradise available for mankind, so to speak. So that's monomyth and true myth in a nutshell.
Yeah. And then there's the reversal of everything, right? Death becomes life and resurrection. And that is that moment is the center of our history. If you look at medieval maps, the medieval maps always put Jerusalem in the middle, and they always had, Europe in one corner, Africa in one corner, Asia above it, and paradise on top. And so the way people Christians for 2,000 years have understood this is one giant story by one storyteller, literally the word, verbum or logos. And so here you're telling us a tale where Our Lady turns a failed quest into a successful quest, and that is the gospel. That is the good news, that you're worthy already, and that leads to the conversion of not only Mexico but of the Americas.
Right, exactly. What we're essentially saying is that this earlier story of the failed hero is part one of a big meta-narrative, God's salvific plan for the Americas, and it functions very much like the failed hero that we see all across the pagan world. Of course, it happens in sort of a way with the Hebrews, of course, but the fulfillment, when Juan Diego goes to the top of the hill, he's fulfilling the quest that had eluded the singer for thousands of years. This is just one aspect, but of course, as we were saying, the flowers are a metaphor for truth. So he finds the fruit, he finds the truth, and essentially, if you tie that in with also that a part of the story was that only the God of fear, God of far and near, in Tlok and Nahuatl, the God of far and near, can make one worthy. Well, when Guadalupe addresses herself as the mother of the God of far and near, everything ties together. Guadalupe is the mother of the one who can make you worthy for paradise, for eternal life with your creator. And of course, we wouldn't know that unless we knew the earlier backstory. But what ends up happening is that if you tie the hero's quest, it's a way to be able to explain something very simply, in a very simple manner to people. Did the hero find the quest or did he not? Well, in this case, Juan Diego did find the truth as a baptized Christian. This is a super important part of the story. Because he found the flowers of truth, he is finding Jesus Christ, the one who by his sacrifice make one worthy to enter the flower world paradise, to be with eternity with your creator for all of eternity. So we believe that it's a long process of what happened, of how this story would have gotten out to the millions of people. It would have been turned into a flower song poem, which would have gotten out to millions of people. And we can go into that later. But we're saying there's so many connections. We specifically narrow it down to 4 connections, which we call the 4 conceptual pillars, which we outline in chapter 2 of our book, in order to try to help the reader to be able to see these concepts, how they started from the very beginning of Mesoamerican civilization and how they develop over the centuries, and they climax with this poet conference in 1490, where they really think about and fully flesh so many of these philosophical ideas, which just a few decades later in 1531, they all come together and crescendo into this symphony of meaning to the Nawa, where they're able to say, God has been looking out for us all this time. God has been laying out a foundation of concepts that are being fulfilled through Christianity. And how do we get that? Well, we have to get baptized. And as the story goes, millions were craving this baptism after the apparition of Guadalupe.
Yeah. And you make the point that there's a lot of symbolism present there that, people would not have registered it on a conscious level, because your average 16th century person hasn't been to graduate school, but they would recognize deep down the symbols of this flower mountain, or the water mountain, or the vertical axis and the horizontal axis of the heaven and the earth, of the cave, of the four petaled flower, which is kind of a cruciform flower, but is also part of this Nahuatl symbol of the altapetal, which James Lockhart discovered in the 80s.
Oh, good.
Yes, you know about that.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and then you show in your book that there is exactly one 4-petaled flower on the image of Our Lady on the tilma, and it happens to be in the center on her womb, which is exactly the center of the world, which is exactly where Jesus is. And again, that's part of the cruciform. The symbol of the cross is there too. That's wonderful. It's just wonderful how it's all written in to the fabric of the world.
Absolutely. Just to kind of expand on that idea, a major concept that we see all throughout ancient Mesoamerica is, as you mentioned, this concept of the axis mundi, and I'm going to attempt to explain it right now. The known universe is described as a horizontal plane where you have north, south, east, and west. And as these lines, they cross, to a center point. And what is important is that from this center point, we get a vertical axis. And that vertical axis leads us to another dimension. It could lead us to the underworld, but can also lead us to a supernatural realm. So the axis mundi is a 3-dimensional model of something that's beyond our comprehension, beyond the dimension in which we live. So what happened uniquely probably in Mesoamerica is that these 4 directions were portrayed as a 4-petaled flower. And what it's signifying is that it is through beauty, signified in a flower, that we're able to give a glimpse of ultimate beauty that exists in this divine realm. And that really shows that in Mesoamerican man, they tried to reach divine things, divine truth, through artistic means such as flower song poems, through mural paintings, through pottery shards, through their artwork, the thing that we see in material archaeological finds. And that is really the basis of flower world, where anthropologists, archaeologists, and linguists are actually making these connections because they're seeing this specifically, this 4-petaled flower configuration all over the place. And they're saying that this east to west direction is the way in which many of these ancient cities, such as Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, which is right outside of Mexico City, and we have the remains of those 3 wonderful pyramids. And what happens is that it's a way in which they're interpreting, especially things that have just been found recently, and we can go into that, such as a shaft that have been found both under the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Plumed Serpent. So all these things, man was centered on this 4-petaled flower. It meant he was craving that connection to divinity. And of course, the way that it works into the tilma is that 4-petaled flower is over the womb of Our Lady of Guadalupe in the tilma. And one way to explain it is that we're seeing it on a 2-dimensional surface, but if you try to see it as a 3-dimensional image, that actually the center point is kind of like a wormhole to eternity. And of course, what is happening over her womb, it is a wormhole to Jesus Christ, who is the truth, who is the logos, who is the one that who by his sacrifice allows us to be able to go to that supernatural dimension.
Yeah, I was at Teotihuacan 5 years ago with one of my kids, and we just went there and climbed the Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon. Nice. And they have a beautiful museum there where you can see a lot of the imagery that you are describing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So today I tend to think of Mexico as a very faithful country. I've visited, 5 times, and you can always find a mass on any given day in any little town. But I also know that there's a sort of anti-clerical secular movement that started, especially in the 20th century, especially after the revolution. I know that the long period of PRI rule has sort of downplayed the authority of the church. And there's, of course, the Cristero War. A lot of my students are from Mexico and Latin America, and it's really interesting to talk to them because many are Catholic, some are evangelical Christian, but then there's also these kind of like interesting other religions that are, I don't want to say syncretic, but they have elements of Christianity, but also elements of older beliefs. And I've talked to historians who talk about like sort of what do you call it? Covert sacrifice that goes on, at least in like Zapotec culture here and there. So you know much more about this. How would you describe Mexico today? How would you describe the Catholic Church there or other Christian denominations? And also persistent strains of paganism, all these centuries later. What's your take?
Well, many historians have written about that. In fact, they actually give it a term. They call it Mexican Catholicism. And unfortunately, what that means is that they say that from the very beginning, and they actually bring up Guadalupe to say that from the very beginning of this massive conversion, paganism was always there, and paganism runs throughout Mexican Catholicism. They say that it's a unique type of Catholicism because it so overtly brings in pagan elements. Now, of course, you could extend that argument, and many Protestants can actually say that Catholicism has so many pagan elements into it. So we're not alone on that charge, but it's very pronounced. And unfortunately, so many Mexicans and maybe even Mexican Americans here in the United States, and I see it in California a lot, they tend to believe that Guadalupe was an Aztec goddess. And they even refer to as Tonantzin. Now, there's a lot of that phrase is loaded, and it's beyond what we can bring up right now. But essentially, it's saying that it's proof that this is occurring. Of course, the danger in that is that by saying that Guadalupe is a pagan goddess, you're just one step away from this concept called La Santa Muerte, which is this very demonic belief that is used by so many of these narco traffickers and human traffickers in order. It's a demon that they pray to. And but also, you not only have that happening, and it seems to be rising within these communities, but at the same time, the evangelicals, the Protestants, are kind of picking off Catholics. We've lived in Mexico on and off for many years, and we've seen that. So the thing is that the problem with that, and hopefully what our book will help with, is that we're saying that you can have pagan elements but they point you to the fullness of Christianity. This is the way in which it actually looked in history. Why would you want to go back to that pagan time period and believe this? Everything was moving you towards victory in Jesus Christ. So I think it's very important, as we were talking about stories, and stories define ourselves. Would you like to define yourself as an Aztec warrior, like many of these gang members and many of these narco-trafficantes do, as they're saying, well, we must not be afraid of death. We must be able to fight. We must be able to kill. But the thing is that Jesus Christ offers a better story. Actually, if you are Mexican or if you are Latin America, true Catholicism is in your DNA, and you got to get back to that. That is actually being truly Hispano or Latino or however you want to call it, not this new kind of paradigm that's only really been around for a few decades. So, I think I'm answering Chris. There's a lot more that we could talk about: immigration, transhumanism, different things like that. But that's kind of in a nutshell what we think is going on right now.
How about the marigolds in El Dia de los Muertos? Is that a related? Flowers as a bridge to the next world, I think.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the way in which beauty and art plays in giving us a glimpse of the transcendent. Benedict XVI wrote a lot about this, about the role of art, the role of beauty, and why it's so important for us to experience beauty on a daily basis. And because it takes us out of our daily existence, and it gives us a glimpse of the divine. So that's why I think our roles as artists, Of course, leading chant and leading beautiful polyphony in the traditional Latin Mass is so important to us because it does that function. It gives us a glimpse of eternity. So,
yeah.
In summary, we usually kind of sum up things by talking about what this means for us today in terms of the chaotic times that we live in. You want to go there with this?
Perfect. Yeah.
If we take into consideration the time period that Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared in, it's in the 1500s, and it's just exiting out of a period of massive sacrifice for the Mexica Empire. So they were kind of already undergoing a death of sorts, and then with the Spanish coming in, and there's a multitude of change. But we're also dealing with the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, where millions of people left the church, and it was going through a massive amount of chaos. A lot of people just were very confused on what the church taught, who God was, what their lives meant. Everything was up in the air, and right into the middle of that, Our Lady of Guadalupe steps in and starts giving answers and starts paving a way on how we can hang on in the midst of such tumultuous times. And we kind of equate that we believe Our Lady of Guadalupe, especially in today's times, it's kind of a perfect answer for a lot of that, because for the Mexica, it pulled them out of a pagan area and into a Christian era. And for the church at large, it was sort of a rejuvenation for a lot of the sort of the death blows it was taking from other quarters in Europe, because even one of the missionaries on the ground made the comment that the numbers that converted of the 9 to 10 million, God saw fit to bring the numbers back into the church that had been lost in the Protestant Reformation. So I don't know, we always consider it a point of hope and sort of a reminder that God is in control of history, because so much of the crux of the book is that God prepared 3,000 years worth of Mesoamerican history to kind of prepare people for this eventual truth. And why can't he do that now, as dark as it may seem?
And why is he not doing that?
Why is he not already doing that? Maybe we don't see it right in the moment, but he's still moving. He's still altering the landscape. We just have to open ourselves to that.
And so we have our marching orders, and we're going to hold on, and we're going to spread the good news of the Lord. And he's not a God of trends. He's a God of enormous big picture, sudden miracles, sudden reversals. You think he's dead, but no, he's not. He's actually conquered death. So
absolutely.
So we should not be worried. As Pope John the 23rd used to say, like, it's your world, Lord. I'm going to bed. you know what to do next. So
yeah, we can trust.
Yeah. Would you like to close us with a blessing or a prayer?
Yes, let's do the Ave Maria in Latin.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready.
In nome Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancto. Amen.
Amen.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum,
benedicta
tu in
mulieribus,
et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Amen.
Patri, Filii, Spiritus Sancto. Amen.
Deus
Chris Odinitz and Joseph and Monique Gonzalez recorded this conversation, episode 74, on November 13th, 2023. It was the feast day of Mother Cabrini, an Italian-American foundress of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I just saw a trailer for a movie about her coming out next year from Angel Studios. It looks pretty amazing. Our logo is from a stained glass window at the Spanish monastery of Santo Domingo de Silos, and the photo comes from the Dominican Friars of England, Scotland, and Wales at www.english.op.org. The music for this episode is from Misa Azteca by Joseph Julian Gonzalez, composed in 1997. I took pieces from several movements, the first, the third, and the fifth, but I hope everybody listens to the whole thing and you will find it below. Thank you for listening, dear brothers and sisters, and please email me anytime at almostgoodcatholics@gmail.com. It will be a pleasure for me to hear from you. Talk to you next time.
Bye.